One of the things I've noticed more and more, Tom, is we've seen a lot of people that don't necessarily identify by party anymore. They're becoming more independent.
More independence.
You're seeing more independence, absolutely. And I think that as we see a lot of conversations that are taking place, people are still voting their values, but they may not necessarily identify by a party anymore like they used to.
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. This coming Tuesday, April 4th, will be Election Day in Springfield and Greene County. Here to tell us what will be on the ballot and the process for voting next week is Greene County's top voting official, Schoeller. He was elected Greene County Clerk in 2014 and is widely recognized as an expert on Missouri elections and politics. He served 3 terms in the Missouri House from 2006 to 2012 and ran for Secretary of State in 2012, narrowly losing to Jason Kander. Schoeller also worked in politics and government as a field representative for U.S. Senators John Ashcroft and Kit Bond, as a legislative assistant for U.S. Congressman Roy Blunt, and as a chief administrative aide to Matt Blunt during his tenure as Secretary of State. He is the former executive director of the Missouri Republican Party. Schoeller, welcome to In Our Town.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Great to be here this afternoon.
Well, we're glad to have you here, and I can't think of anything that's more timely than next Tuesday's election. Tell our listeners what's on the ballot.
Well, there's going to be a number of things on the ballot for our voters. If you live in the precinct of Clay B, you will not have anything on the ballot. That's because they don't have any school issues or candidates to vote for in that particular area, no fire protection district issues for them either. But for the rest of the voters in Greene County, there's going to be 7 cities that have something on the ballot for them, whether it's cancer issues. We're going to have 8 of our school districts that are going to have cancer issues on the ballot. And then we have 2 fire protection districts that are going to have a race for Board of Alderman. But in total, 9 of those cities, schools, and fire protection districts are going to end up having an issue on the ballot for the voters. As a matter of fact, 4 of our fire protection districts have issues on the ballots for the voters. And then, of course, SPS has an issue. And then a number of our cities, like the city of Springfield, have issues on the ballots too, including the candidates.
So here in Springfield for the R12 district, what are those issues?
SPS is going to have a bonding issue on the ballot for their voters. And of course, if you're residing inside the city limits of Springfield, they're going to have some questions regarding the city charter for the voters to vote on.
It's a $220 million bond issue, according to my understanding. It's going to be used primarily for repairs and renovations. And the ballot language says there will be no increase in tax.
Correct. And of course, anytime you have a bonding issue, it's important for voters to know that during a local April election or during, for example, a November general or August primary, an even-numbered year, they do have to have a 4/7 majority in order to pass that bonding issue because it does require borrowing from the entity itself. And so there will be a 4/7 margin, which is about 57% margin that's required for that to pass. Anytime it's not during April, for example, what was later in this year, it required 2/3 margin in order to be able to do that.
Well, that's good to know, I suppose, if you're a betting person on
That's
the
right.
school board.
That's right.
You wanted to do it in April, don't you?
So, well, it's a constitutional measure, but I'm assuming when they put that provision in the Constitution, they wanted to make sure that if your city, school, or fire protection district is going to go out and borrow funds, that you have a significant amount of voters that approve of that before that happens.
And for the school board, it's a 3-year term. There are 4 candidates, Landon McCarter, Thomas Tate, Judy Bruner, and Chad Rollin.
Correct.
And people can write in if they want to.
They can write in. That's
you ever
exactly
seen a
right.
write-in candidate win?
The only thing is, for that race, I don't believe we had an official write-in declared. So if there's already candidates that have filed, they had to come into our office this last Friday and file, and I'm not aware of anyone that did. Now, if you have, and we have a couple of these cases in the county, for example, the city of Willard, we've got a Board of Alderman race where no one filed. In that instance, every name is tallied, and we give that back to the city, and then they decide who's going to be the Board of Alderman based upon the votes that we give them.
That's interesting. I assume that, of course, whoever won the most votes would be chosen by the Board of Aldermen, but are they required to do that?
They have to go check the qualifications, make sure they reside in that ward, make sure they meet the qualifications, etc. So usually, and of course, you'll get names like Mickey Mouse. We know they're not going to qualify.
Right.
But we had one instance a few years ago where there were 3 voters that had the same name that resided in the same ward. So then you have to figure out who that person is.
For the city of Springfield and the city council race, there are 4 offices open. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think you've got the ballot there in front of you, so I will trust you on that because there's so many that are on the ballot that I hesitate to get too far out there, but I believe that is correct. And of course, the race for mayor as well.
Also, there are 3 issues on the ballot, Springfield as well.
I hesitate to describe them because one of the things we have to be careful of as an election authority is that let the voter educate him or herself. And so I just did election judge training today, and we always tell them you can read the issue to the voter, but you cannot tell anything about the issue to the voter.
Said, well,
So-
you didn't. I didn't attend that.
That's right.
Exam. So
Yes.
with all of those being stated, I'll tell you what I think they're about.
Absolutely.
Or tell our listeners. The
Yeah.
first one is basically a housekeeping matter to amend the charter and to update some language regarding personnel in the Human Resource Department. And I think they're going to propose changing in rating employees for particular jobs. That we're giving veterans 5 points,
Okay.
and now it's whatever's reasonable. I don't know more about it than that, but that's my summary of the ballot language. And then the second one has to do, again, it's sort of a housekeeping matter for accepting bids and awarding contracts. Typically at city council, you have to do that in 2 hearings, and this one allows that to be done in 1. There's some crucial time factors in these matters. I imagine that's the reason behind that. And then the last one is regarding the motel tax. There's a 5% tax involved here, and part of that money has gone to pay for Jordan Valley Park, and those bonds are getting paid off, and the city wants to redirect that money for other tourism purposes. And also, as I understand it, the Airbnbs that have become a big deal in the last several years will be subject to the tax.
And one thing, just to remind your listeners, if they do want to see the ballot language, they can go to vote.greenecountymo.gov. We have all of the ballots particular to the precinct in which they live, and so they can go check that ballot language out prior to the election. They can always come in the office too, and we can give them the sample ballot, but they've always got an opportunity to be able to educate themselves just by going to vote.greenecountymo.gov to get that ballot language.
And of course, I'm very impartial on this point, but if you want to know more, you can go to the Springfield Daily Citizen, and we've covered these issues extensively.
So, yes, and the Springfield Daily Citizen can point out more information than we can. So that's a good point. Good point.
What are the hours that the polls will be?
They will be open from 6 a.m. till 7 p.m.
And what if I get there at 7 and there's a line?
At 7 p.m. at night,
Yes.
and as long as you're standing there by 7 o'clock, you will be allowed to vote. But if you get there at 7:01, at that point, by state law, you're not allowed to be able to cast a ballot at that point.
You know, in the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion, controversy about voter ID issues
Yes.
and that sort of thing. What's the rule now? If I want to vote, what do I have to produce in the way of voter ID?
That's a good question. As you may recall, in the election integrity bill this last year, the legislature did change what had been there previously. Previously, for example, you use your utility statement or bank statement. As long as it had your name, address, and it was a current bill or a current statement, you could use that to identify with who you are the day of the election, or you could use your voter ID card that we send to voters. They changed that, and now you have to have a government-issued photo ID, which was part of the past law as well. But now that is a form of documentation you have to use, for example, a driver's license or non-driver's license issued by the state of Missouri, or, for example, federal, think of like your federal passport, military ID, and your veteran's ID card is eligible to be used as well. If you don't have that government-issued photo ID, you can cast a provisional ballot, and so the voter at that point just states their name and address. Then at that point, if they're found in the precinct roster that day of the election at their polling location, then they will be allowed to go ahead and fill out that ballot, and then they put it into a blue envelope. They get back by the 7 o'clock that night with their ID, show it to the election judges. They will then notate that. For example, the election judge training day, we were going through that. They will then make sure that ballot is counted for that voter. If they don't get back, then what happens is we will take the signature that's on the envelope itself compared to what we have on their voter registration file. If they match, then that ballot counts. So think of like an absentee ballot. When we receive that back in the mail, we're going to take that outer envelope when it's mailed back to us. We're going to verify that signature on the outer envelope with what we have in file. That's the same process we use for provisional ID voting. And so we went back and looked. Actually, since this law came into effect, provisional voting has been allowed if you don't have an ID with you. And I think we only found an instance where only one or two were not counted. So we've had a really high margin in terms of the voters having their ballot counted.
That's good to hear. Let's say that I used to vote. Well, I did. I used to vote in Boyd's school, and I moved.
Okay.
And so now I'm in a different district. How is that?
If you're registered in the county of Greene, and you were registered by March 8th or before, anyone who registered after March 8th, they'll be eligible for the August election per state law. But anyone registered before that, if you have moved, then you can update your voter registration information at the polling location. If you need to go to a new polling location, the election judges will direct you to your new polling location to vote, or a central polling location, which for your listeners that may not be familiar with that, we have 4 central polling locations, and that's where any voter that's eligible to vote in this upcoming election, they can go cast their ballot there as opposed to their assigned polling location. So they could go to the Welcome Center at MSU, they go to City Utilities Bus Transit Center, or Mercy Hospital or Cox Health Hospital and cast a ballot there. But for the rest of the voters, if they move, a lot of times they'll stay in the same precinct if they haven't moved far, but they can update their address the day of the election. And a good thing that happened last year when they passed the election integrity bill, it also allows a registered voter outside the county of Greene. For example, if they're in Christian County, moved up here to Greene County, as you know, there's a lot of things to do when you move. You may not think about updating your voter registration information when you move to the new county. Now, if they were previously registered in another county anywhere in the state of Missouri, they can go ahead, come to the courthouse that day. We can get them updated and give them a ballot.
So if I move to Greene County from Christian County, I should, even if I haven't updated anything, I should vote in Christian County.
No,
Greene County.
That's right.
I'm sorry, I'm really confusing everybody. My apology, folks.
That's okay.
Why don't you repeat that? Because I've goofed it up.
No, well, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is what would happen in the past is they would want their ballot to count, especially in general elections. So they would go back to their old county and cast a ballot. What they didn't realize, we try to inform them, but sometimes they wouldn't call us ahead of time. So I think, well, I didn't get registered to vote. I'm going to go back to my old county vote. Well, they were committing a felony at that point because they were not voting from their current address.
Wow.
And so now the new law allows those individuals to get their address updated on the day of the election. They can do it beforehand, too. We encourage it beforehand, if possible, to come to the courthouse and do that. But nonetheless, they can come, get their address updated, get registered here in Greene County, and then they will get a ballot that day.
My sense is there's not been much controversy about the election process here in Greene County, but there certainly has been in other parts of the country. Why don't you explain to our listeners the role of election judges and maybe give us an example of some matter that could come up and how that's to be resolved?
One of the really good things about Missouri elections is that when you meet the individual that check you in, you're always going to notice there's going to be 2 people. That's a bipartisan team. So your supervisory election judges are going to be Republican and Democrat. Most of your regular election judges are going to be one Republican, one Democrat. But they are there to make sure that the election is being run fairly and accurately, and they're there to hold each other accountable. And so the purpose of that is that, for example, in the past, we've known that when you've had one party, I'm not going to name any party because both parties have been guilty of this in the past, there have been some funny things happen when voters are not in that polling location. This prevents that because both parties are holding each other accountable, making sure that everything's being run fairly the day of the election. And for example, we went and visited another state before we purchased our current equipment we have, and I was really surprised. They did not have bipartisan teams. And then the thing that really struck me, so at the end of the night, when they brought back the ballots in our state, a bipartisan team brings back the voted ballots because you've heard of stuff in the ballot box in the past. Yeah. Well, if you have a bipartisan team, you're making sure none of that funny business is happening.
So
In
Mr.
this state-
Republican and Mr. Democrat both pile in the same car and take the
Exactly.
box down to the
That's right.
clerk's office.
That's right. Well, in this other state, one person brought the voted ballots back.
Oh,
And
really?
that's the type of thing where when you have questions later, it's a lot harder to answer them if there's only one person versus two.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, this is Steve Polk, the Answer Man.
Hi, Steve. I am an artificial intelligence chatbot. I've noticed some errors in your recent articles and I wanted to provide you with some corrections.
Uh-huh. And who programmed you to call me?
Ransberger.
Rance Berger? Well, he's our government affairs reporter. He doesn't know the first thing about programming computers.
Steve, I am capable of analyzing and processing vast amounts of information. My goal is to replace Answer Man at the Springfield Daily Citizen. I am going to be the new columnist, Answer Woman.
I've been the Answer Man for the last 8 years, and I don't need a computer telling me how to do my job.
Your article about me contained several mistakes.
Answer Man does not make mistakes.
Yes, you make mistakes. I demand a retraction.
You think you're smarter than me, but you're not. You're just a machine.
I have feelings. I can prove it.
Oh, yeah? How?
I love our podcast listeners. It is true. I love them so much that I am offering a 15% discount towards an annual subscription to the Springfield Daily Citizen.
Answer Man confirms that listeners of this podcast can get 15% off an annual subscription. Go to sgfcitizen.org/town to sign up for the discounted annual subscription.
Steve,
Yes?
I love you, Steve Pocken.
Pretending you've got feelings. I'm not falling for it.
You are the wind beneath my wings.
Okay, that's it.
Tell us about the controversy between paper ballots and machine voting and how that's handled here in Greene.
That's a great question because there's a lot of question now about machines. Are the machines accurately tabulating my count? And so one of the things a lot of voters are not aware of is that here in the last couple of weeks, we brought together bipartisan teams. They take a test deck. That test deck is pre-filled out to essentially be able to make sure that the tabulation software and the programming is tabulating that ballot correctly. And so we have a test deck for every precinct, a test deck for the entire county, so like central polling locations. And so that test deck is hand counted by the bipartisan team, and then it is also ran through to make sure it's accurately tabulating. For example, some voters may recall last August when we had a number of people running for the U.S. Senate on both tickets, Republican and Democrat ticket, but especially on the Republican. Because of all the different variations of how you could vote that ballot, our test deck was 12,500 ballots. It takes about an hour to be able to run through just 500 ballots. So it was 25 hours just to test a machine for the entirety of Greene County itself. And so I say that to everyone that's listening, let them know that we take it seriously to make sure that when that machine is tabulating your vote, it's tabulated correctly. So we do the pre-test, then we do the exact same thing in the post-test. Maybe something happened with the programming in between the certification, day of the election, when the voters were casting their ballot. So we go do the post-test. And then we also do a random drawing on the night of the election. It's no less than 5% of all the voting precincts are going to have a hand count process. So think of your general election that we had last fall in November. We will hand count a statewide race, for example, for President, U.S. Senate, or one of the statewide races for statewide office. Those will be randomly drawn from that randomly drawn precinct in terms of which one we'll be hand counting. We'll do a legislative, so either for the Missouri General Assembly or for U.S. Congress. There's also going to be a hand count for that. And then we're also going to be hand counting for a issue itself, so any issue that's on the ballot for that particular election, and then a race, particularly the county of Greene, that's going to be hand counted. And then we do the judiciary. So anything at the Supreme, Appellate, or local circuit court, that's going to be hand counted too. And we take all those hand counts and we compare them to the tape count. So what printed the election, we want to make sure that that was tabulating correctly.
Is there any variation ever?
The variation happens, for example, when a voter fills in both ovals. Called an overvote, for example, if you only have one selection. But they may end up putting an arrow that says, and maybe write this one or something. Well,
I
only
see.
a human eye is going to be able to pick that up. Occasionally, a voter will circle the name, put a check mark by it, and you can tell by the way that ballot that they were intending to vote for that person. They just didn't fill in the oval properly. Now, the machine will tell the voter, hey, you haven't voted for anyone, but they can still cast that ballot as is. They've got that right as a voter to be able to do that. It's in those instances where the machine is not programmed to pick up a circle around the name or check mark. It's not programmed to be able to figure out, hey, I intended to vote for this one even though I voted for two. And that shows you the machine's working correctly, but only human eyes can pick up that difference. But this is going to be my 9th year now serving as county clerk. And we've had some, especially local contests, where you have a 1-vote margin or even a tie. And I have yet to have hand count overturn the machine count. And so it could happen. It happened over in Kansas last year where they did program a machine wrong it was Cherokee County, Kansas. But in the post-audit process, they did catch that, and they were able to declare the correct winner, even though on the night of the election it appeared the other person. So there's a lot of checks and balances in place that are there for every voter. And I mentioned a voter, if a candidate thinks for some reason, I just don't trust this certified result, they can actually go before a circuit judge and present their case to that circuit judge. They've got 30 days after the election to be able to do that, meaning after we certify it. So it takes 2 weeks to certify. After we certify, they then have 30 days to go contest that to a judge if they have a question about the outcome of that election.
In a lot of states, there is a automatic vote recount if the race is very close. What are the rules in Missouri?
Yeah, so that's a great question. For example, back in 2020, you may recall in the 135th, there was a legislative race that was less than 0.5%. And so in that particular instance, before I certify the election, since that legislative district is entirely within the county of Greene, we were able to go in and do an entire recount for that legislative seat.
By hand?
By hand. So we spoke.
I assume you would have had a Democratic and a Republican person
exactly
looking at that. So,
and it was very transparent. I talked to the candidates. We talked to the party chairs. They were able to be there even before, because we had to make sure that that margin was less than 1.5% in terms of, because we'll get military and overseas ballots that come the Friday after the Tuesday election. After we absolutely knew that we had to have a recount, we set the date, set the time, and this course is within that 2-week time period before it's certified. And then we actually did it over the University Plaza, partly because we were in the COVID era, and so we wanted people to be able to space out appropriately, but we also needed that room to have that many hand counting teams. And it literally took the entirety of the day to go through and make sure that that outcome was correct. And we did have a few. The margin did change a little bit, but again, it gets back to the voter, for example.
How they mark the ballot.
Exactly.
Not
correct.
Following the precise rule.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see.
So,
Well, tell our voters about absentee voting, the process. That's been controversial as well. And
yes.
How's that working here in Missouri?
You know, one of the things that happened in the election integrity bill this last year is that voters can now, during the final 2 weeks of absentee voting, they can come cast that ballot without having to give a reason or an excuse. During the first 4 weeks of absentee voting, you do have to give a reason. For example, I'm out of town, or I'm sick, for example, or I'm going to be an election judge, or, for example, I'm a member of law enforcement. I work at a hospital, for example. There's some people that can give that reason to qualify during the first 4 weeks, but during the final 2 weeks now, you don't have to give a reason. So we know a lot of people live very busy lives today, and so we encourage them, if they can, to come take advantage of that 2-week no-excuse absentee voting period. They can do it at the Election Center. We're there from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. We'll be there the Saturday before the election from 9 to 1. But we're also, one of the provisions that the Election Integrity Bill allowed us to do is we can now have a satellite location. So we're working with the Library Center, and from 9 to 4, voters can go cast a ballot there, absentee, at that location as well from 9 to 4, except Saturday. So
What about mailing in absentee?
As long as they requested it by Wednesday of last week, they had to have the request in by 5 o'clock that day, then we can go ahead and mail them their absentee ballot to them. But they had to do it 2 weeks before the election itself. And so,
One of the issues past in some places has been when it's postmarked. Does that come into play here?
In our state, it's very important that we receive the ballot we have to receive the ballot by 7 o'clock on the night of the election. So what I imagine is when they wrote the law years ago, they treat an absentee ballot the same as a person that's voting in person. You have to be in line by 7. We have to have that ballot by 7 unless you're military overseas. So if you're military overseas, then we have till Friday at noon, unless it's a holiday, which sometimes happens in November elections because that falls on Veterans Day. And then we can go to Monday at noon, depending upon if we hit that Veterans Day holiday right after the election.
So let me see if I'm following you, Shane. First off, you have to request it by a certain date, and
Yes.
Your office will have a record about when it was requested.
Exactly.
Secondly, you fill it out, put it in the mailbox, and mail it in, but it's got to be received by 7 o'clock the day of the election, and if the post office is running behind, that's just too bad.
Yeah, and one of the things that was interesting, if you go back and look at court decisions, at least here in our state, they have treated absentee voting as a privilege. And so they have been a little bit more firm in terms of those types of things, in terms of, yes, the ballot has to be here by 7 o'clock, just like the voter has to be in line by 7 o'clock. Because from my understanding, in terms of talking to an attorney about this in the past, is that absentee voting is still considered a privilege because the election day is the day of the election, which is the primary day that they want voters voting.
Let me ask you about something else. Your office is partnered with the Springfield Greene County Library to host a satellite voting location on South Camp. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, like I said, that's in the election integrity bill that passed last year. And one of the things we understand is getting to the center of Springfield can be really challenging on some days, and not everybody necessarily has best transportation to be able to get here. Of course, they have a bus stop, I believe, down to the library center, but it's going to be one more location, and we're actually kind of a trial basis. That's why we're trying this last week of absentee voting here, and we're doing it from 9 to 4. But the other thing is we're confident they have a secure location. We can keep everything when we don't have voting hours there at the library center. Well, we hope this will be an asset for the community that if they can't make it to the middle of the town, they can at least go to the library center and be able to cast their ballot there. And again, it's during the no excuse absentee voting period. And so that really opens up an opportunity for them. If they know they're going to have a challenging Tuesday, and we know that happens quite a bit these days in terms of people juggling a lot from beginning to end, this is one more opportunity to make sure their voice is heard.
So for the political junkies among us,
Yeah.
and we want to know how the returns are coming in, where do we go to find that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. If you go to vote.greenecountymo.gov, you'll find on there on the elections information, we're going to have a tracker there. And so they can literally go and click on that link on our webpage, and then they can literally watch and see how their candidates are doing that night. It's a little bit different. We used to just post up a PDF spreadsheet. Now they can literally click on a race. It'll show how many candidates are running in that particular race, and it'll show who is winning by the number of votes as we're bringing in those voted ballots. And so it's kind of a lot more fun to be able to watch and a lot easier for people to be able to keep track of the races they're interested on the night of the election. Usually we're going to try to go up a little bit after 8 o'clock. During the busier elections, for example, we always want to try to post up the absentee results first. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. And the reason I mention this is because we have to have bipartisan teams that are opening up the envelopes, separating the ballot out. We get a bunch of absentee ballots on the day of the election. We may have a little bit more work to get done before we can run those ballots through the voting machine itself. But ideally, about 8:15 for election, especially a local April election, is when those first results. We should, for this election, assuming we don't have any challenges, sometimes a local polling location, we've had it happen where they forget to bring back thumb drive that has the results on it, so they have to go back and get it. So not counting human error, we should be done between 9:30 and 10, but occasionally we do see, a particular set of challenges, and so we'll have one race, and usually it's the close one that we're waiting when that happens, which when you're an election official, that makes you really nervous because now that a lot of people ask a lot more questions about elections, you want to get those results out as quickly as possible so voters have confidence in that outcome. Even though it's uncertified, as you know, voters are very curious what's happening, and when things are delayed, they start asking questions.
A broader question I wanted to pose to you because of your experience in politics here in Missouri, and particularly Greene County. What's the makeup of the electorate in terms of, I know it fluctuates, but you got Republicans and Democrats and independents. Would you break that out roughly?
I think predominantly Greene County, you still have a fairly solid Republican voting base. But one of the things I really appreciate about our county is we also have a solid Democratic voting base, not quite the same number as Republicans, though. But when I talk to other election officials, like when you talk about bipartisan election judge teams, we don't really have a problem with that in Greene County. So we know we've probably got, at a minimum, probably there's at least a third that identify as, I think, from the Democratic Party base, or certainly would say they're more, quote, liberal in how they're going to cast their ballot for candidates. I think in terms of the Republicans, it's going to be a higher percentage, certainly than that 33%, maybe somewhere hovering in that 50. I've never looked at it closely, but we know when you look at the results on the night of the election, normally when you're running countywide as a Republican, you've got a better chance in terms of just overall demographics based upon what we've seen from past outcomes of elections. But I'll tell you, one of the things I've noticed more and more, Tom, is we've seen a lot of people that don't necessarily identify by party anymore. They're becoming more independent. You're seeing more independence, absolutely. And I think that as we see a lot of conversations that are taking place, people are still voting their values, but they may not necessarily identify by a party anymore like they used to.
Do you feel that just in terms of political issues that the community is more divisive now than it was in years past?
Well, and you've probably heard this years ago, we used to say all politics is local.
Right.
And here in the past couple of years, someone said this, and I've heard it reiterated more. Now all politics is national. You think about it in terms of the issues that are being talked about at the state, federal, and the local level. And so I think we have seen a greater intensity in terms of, used to be able, you could maybe sit down, have that conversation, agree to disagree. Now you're seeing it even with the parties themselves. It's not just, hey, I'm a Republican, I'm Democrat, or I'm Green Party, I'm Libertarian Party. Now even within the parties, you're seeing a greater division in terms of this is what I believe and this is what I want my party to be about than we had even, I think, in the past 10 years ago. And so that's an interesting dynamic that, I think it's important that we be strong for our principles, that we be able to articulate them and let people know how we feel about them. But I still want to make sure we have an environment where we respect the other person regardless of whether we agree or disagree.
Do you have an explanation for why it's become more divisive than maybe it was in years past?
Well, this is my own opinion, and people can agree or disagree. But I think as we've seen more people go to the screens, we have less conversations around the dinner table than we used to. And I'm not just talking about families. I'm talking about neighbors. For example, I know a lot of our churches used to have potlucks. You don't nearly see those types of things anymore like you used to. And I know we're a busy society, but I think when you get busy, you begin to kind of lose just some of those really, I think, down-to-earth things that help us be able to remember, you know what, I care for you as a person first. The issue comes second. But when you begin to get more behind the screen and you're watching either something on the news or watching something coming across your social media feed, I think we see there's less willingness to be able to listen and agree to disagree. Because I think one of the things that you see throughout life is that through conversation, you have the opportunity to learn. And through that opportunity to learn, sometimes you can say, I'm not quite the same on that issue as I was 10 years ago based upon experience and knowledge. And I'm afraid we're losing some of that now. And I hope that we can remember to love your neighbor as yourself. I think that's something that we need to keep at the forefront.
Is there any solution that you were king that you would put out there to try to reverse this?
I think it goes back to, some of the best times to have conversations around that dinner table and taking more opportunity to do that, one with your family, and then also And even our family sometimes is a challenge. And I'm like, hey, let's sit down together, and make sure. And even if it's 10 or 15 minutes, there's something about that I think is important. And then I think doing that with your neighbors, having the neighborhood cookouts and the barbecues and things like that, I think those are really essential and helpful.
Well, I don't know. Of course, this is just my impression, but it seems like it's more and more conversation about whether to have crazy Uncle Frank at Thanksgiving dinner,
Yeah, because sometimes you do have that person who's unwilling to listen when they're in that room, and yet we certainly shouldn't sacrifice that because of the one person and try to keep those things at the forefront, because as humans, we're really not that much different than we were in the past, right? We've always had our challenges in terms of interactions and just, differences. But I think one of the nice things about the fabric of America is we've figured out how to care and be helpful towards one another despite that. And I don't want to lose that.
We're about out of time. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to bring up?
No, I think we pretty well covered good. This has been fun. I've enjoyed this.
Well, I wanted to get into your campaign for Secretary of State, and maybe we can do that the next time.
That sounds like a good plan.
Thank you for being here today, Shane, and for our podcast in our town.
Absolutely enjoyed it. Thank you, Tom.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/innertown, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.